Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Well, welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Eric Siepen, and across from me is Andy Littleton. He is pastor of Mission Church in Tucson, Arizona. I am pastor of the Village Church in Tucson, Arizona. And we just hang out in this podcast and chat. And we, maybe for some of our listeners, this will be one that they tune out because they don't care about Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll. But since it's close to my heart and a little bit to yours,
Well, and clearly in both of our churches, people are listening to the New Christianity Today podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill.
Yes.
And so, though we know there's a lot of podcasts about the podcast, for our listener base, we thought we'd give you our angle on the whole deal and how it's kind of landing with us. So
right. And maybe, villagers who look up on the screen and they see Mars Hill Church or Team Strike Force or Ezekiel's Cookout, and they're wondering, like, who's... that was one of the big bands early on, was Ezekiel's Cookout. Pretty sweet name for a band.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Anyway, okay.
These are Mars Hill bands. They've had an influence on the community.
Okay.
So,
well, enjoy the podcast, and we appreciate you tuning in.
Yep. Thanks, Andy.
Well, it's been a couple weeks.
It has been a couple weeks.
And here we are, and the biggest thing that came to my mind, probably because the last time I was at an actual breakfast with you, this is a big thing you were talking about anyway, is this new Mars Hill podcast. Yeah. So there are many podcasts about this podcast, and we're just adding to the list, to the noise. But hey, it is what we very well could talk about it if we were just sitting down for breakfast, which is in theory what we're doing. So
yeah. Well, I probably would. We'd talk a little bit about it for sure.
I think we would. It's on people's minds.
So, so there's this podcast that Christianity Today,
The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill.
Mars Hill Church in Seattle, not Mars Hill Church in Michigan or Grand Rapids, which doesn't exist still, I think.
I don't know. That was Rob Bell's church.
Rob Bell, yeah.
It is interesting that the two big kind of leaders that came out of the emergent movement both had a church named Mars Hill. Both aren't at it anymore.
Right.
And ended up going very different directions afterward.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to me.
It is.
So anyway.
Why is Mars Hill Church so important? Why is ex-pastor Mark Driscoll, who has a church in Trinity, it's called Trinity in Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah, he got all the anti-maskers and stuff. He had a growth spurt, I heard. I don't know.
It's about 2,000 now.
Okay.
I think at the height of Mars Hill, they were up about 25,000, somewhere in there.
Yeah. They had many sites, different churches all over the place. It was huge. It was a big thing.
Well, Mars Hill Church in Seattle has had a big influence on the village. In fact, there would be no village without Mars Hill, probably.
Really? Now, okay, tell us about that. How would there be no village without Mars Hill?
Well, how would there be no village with... Well, a couple of things. One, it's interesting just as a reflection. We're probably one of the few churches in the United States that still plays a good chunk of the music that came out of Mars Hill Church as a catalog, which is kind of funny. I mean, so it's part of our connection there. But
what are some of those songs?
Okay,
well, I wouldn't have guessed that you still played.
Oh yeah, we played a ton of them. So ones that people, I mean, I don't know if you would even recognize any of them, but because they're all...
Is this old Mars Hill stuff? Early Mars Hill stuff?
Yeah, for probably the first 15 years, we music mostly from a band called Team Strike Force and from their original band from Brad Curra. So, but they named all their songs from the scripture that they wrote them from. And so it's like Romans 12, Romans 6, Psalm 148.
Okay.
Perseverance, coming out of James chapter 1. Probably be better if the mercy stand firm. Psalm 32, like the word of the Lord, Psalm 46. They're all scripture.
Which is interesting because the era of Mars Hill I am most familiar with is, King's Kaleidoscope, Dustin Kensrue, Citizens, stuff like that. And
they
a little different.
They were
era.
were what you would call the Mars, kind of the Mars Hill went sort of mega and it went male, and so they stopped having women as worship leaders. The women weren't allowed to lead worship anymore.
So they used to be. So yes. they went mega male.
Yes, they went mega male, and so yeah, those guys are a big deal in there. And those guys had more like secular success in the sense of, or at least visibility, because Mars Hill was big. The bands that were playing early on, they were all over Seattle. They had their own bands that had nothing. They weren't even, wouldn't recognize them as, quote unquote Christian bands.
Sure.
They were just playing in clubs, doing their thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I could go. I think more of the recent stuff we played but stopped. We did Poison Tree. We still do the Revelation of Jesus Christ. We haven't done Christ Alone. That's a pretty popular one that people do, but
yeah.
But yeah, I'm not as good at reciting all of the songs that we do, but
yeah, no, that's these are not songs that I am familiar with in connection to Mars Hill. We should state our relationships to this movement really quick, because this is the interesting thing. I, to this day, have still not listened to an entire Mark Driscoll sermon ever. I've heard snippets and clips. Of course, tons of people I've known were very into it. For whatever reason, it just didn't. It's kind of interesting to me. It is interesting. I'm listening to the podcast. It's interesting, but it was never a ministry that I went, oh, at least in the years I was involved. I'm coming along, years after you. In the early years, I might have felt differently. Who knows? But for me, it wasn't something where I said, this is my thing. I'm about this. I want to hear more. I didn't like Mark's, I guess, arrogance ever. Like when I heard clips, people were like, this is awesome. And I thought, that's interesting, but I don't know about awesome. Why would I'm like, I don't know that this is somebody I want to really listen to. And so therefore the whole thing to me was more of a circus to watch than a ministry to be that influenced me, though I know that's quite different for a lot of my peers.
Sure.
And I'm curious about the reasons for that. But you, though, there was a different era.
Yeah, I was there in a different era.
I think my friends who are into Mars Hill differ from you when you were into Mars Hill.
Well, let me just explain. So
you're in message boards with Mark Driscoll and stuff.
I'm on message boards with Mark Driscoll. Let me explain it this way. So in 1996, when I got to Tucson, got married, and started really doing ministry in the community that I was in, I hung out at a lot of coffee shops, and most of my friends were about 5 years younger than me, or 4 years younger than me, and they were all tatted, and they were all, on drugs, and they'd never been to church.
Right.
And I went to El Camino Baptist Church.
Yep.
And at the time, and it's still this way for the most part, is that it's an older congregation that was not going to welcome the people that I was engaged with, nor would they understand what the heck was going on.
And I have a similar sense about what part of why I planted a church.
But I didn't see myself as a church planter or a pastor. I just saw myself as someone wanting these people to know Jesus, and doing ministry in college and singles ministry and campus ministry, and I'm doing all the traditional things like bring Cliff Connectley to the U of A. I was part of that whole, and he still comes.
Cliff, he was the apologist guy.
He's an apologist. So doing that, I would meet with all the campus ministers and pray once a week, and I was doing all that kind of normal ministry kind of stuff. But I had all these friends who didn't fit in any of these areas, and kids that I really cared about. And so I was like, well, I don't know how we're going to do this. And then I just was surfing the web back in the day when it took forever to surf the web. And I stumbled on this church called Mars Hill that had a website that was all built on Flash. So it was totally different than everybody else's website. And they had music and sermons you could download, which I had never seen in my life.
So they were early on that bandwagon.
First.
When I was listening to the podcast and all the stuff about their message boards online, I thought, wow, they were probably one of the few churches you could engage with that way at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were. And so they were advertising this conference, and it cost $50. You just had to get there. It's 3 days. And so Sue and I figured it out. And I remember the plane ticket cost $98 round trip. And we flew up there, and we had our minds blown.
Yeah.
Like, I remember walking into the conference, and there's candles everywhere, and there's velvet, cloth everywhere. And up there is Brad Curra, who I didn't know who he was at the time. And he's singing the songs I've never heard, but are just beautiful and theologically rich and not what you would hear at church. And I just started weeping, like the very first, because I looked around, and these are all people who are church planners and others, but they did not look like anybody that I was used to seeing.
And those are beautiful, both of those. I've experienced things like that, like meeting leaders, and you go, oh, my people.
Yeah.
And it was pretty incredible.
It was a definite meet my people. Yeah. And at that time, just, so then there were people like Doug Padgett and Brian McLaren and Alan Roxborough, and they were all depressed. Everybody, this was a weird conference because everybody got there and said the church is not doing this. It's falling apart. I don't know what to do. So this was not a conference of here's how you should do this. It was, even with Mark. Mark opened up. I mean, I wept the first time I ever heard Mark. He opened up and he said, maybe you are like Cain and you've murdered your brother and you don't know what to do right now. Maybe you're like Moses and you've run away from God and now he's called you. And he went through the entire Old Testament in 20 minutes. And I'm just, my eyes, I'm like, he connected to all of these people, which is what he's good at.
Yeah.
And so I thought, you know what? These people know what they're doing. And in particular, Mars Hill knows what they're doing. I'm just going to eat this up.
Right.
So I even learned to preach from Mark. I picked up a couple of his sermons. I repreached them to figure out how he did it. Because I didn't know what I was doing. And so in a sense, vicariously, or not even vicariously, I just was trained by Mark. So Sue and I would go up every year.
Yeah.
And we would go around to all the different places that Mark, so we go to their Bible studies. We were just like, how are they doing this? What are they doing? And we did that for, I don't know, the first 5-6 years.
And what years are these?
So that's 98. Probably. So it's 98. We planted a church in 2001, but we were traveling up. It was either 98 or 99. I think it might have been 99. But anyways, the Young Leaders Conference, they had two of them. If you listen to the podcast, one was in Glorieta and then one was in Seattle. I had listened to all the tapes from the Glorieta one.
Yeah.
And I went to the Seattle one. I met Andrew Jones. And in fact, I was just in a conversation with Andrew Jones and Brad Curra just on Facebook. You can go find it if you want. We were just talking about music and talking about the podcast a little bit and that kind of stuff. So
it's interesting because I think at a similar time, the thing that had kind of captured my attention about the same time, I think, now that I think about it, was the Passion Conference, or the one-day events by Passion. Okay. I'm just thinking about, that I listened to the first one and I was like, what is this? And then I went to the second one.
Sure.
And it was just it was right around the same time, but a different crowd.
Yeah, very different crowd.
Very different leaders. You've got Louis Giglio, John Piper, Vodi Bakum, which, interestingly enough...
In 99, Vodi was doing stuff?
Vodi Bakum, John Piper, Louis Giglio, and Beth Moore all on the same stage leading together.
Yeah.
Which today feels like, I don't even know if that's possible.
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible either. And what was interesting is, and you'll hear it if you go listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, you will find that Mark had a different vision,
Mm-hmm.
and he was very into bringing artists in and being creative, and they had this idea that, look, people aren't reading scripture. So from Mark's perspective, you need to sit and you need to preach for an hour and make people familiar with scripture, and that you need to sing scripture and in a way that people are familiar with the sound.
Yeah.
So that they can begin to engage, because it's not a literary culture. And at that time I was introduced to really what postmodern philosophy was. I got to sit down. I sat probably an hour with Brian McLaren, and he helped me think some things through transition wise. The leaders were very available.
Yeah.
And that was what was different. And they were looking to encourage young leaders to, and now when you hear the podcast, you're like, okay, well, they're looking for people who are going to do these things.
It's interesting because let's just kind of parallel these for a second. You've got the Mars Hill emergent church movement. You've got something like Passion.
Emergent wasn't around yet, but yes.
Well, we're moving that direction, right? Or people who would then lead in the emergent movement. And Mars Hill would distance from that. You've got the Passion world. I'm trying to think, what are the you've got huge groups of Christians are gathering to these. There's people are going, my people, that's being said in both of those circles. Differences would be, you're talking about this availability, accessibility of the leaders, and the Passion Conference. That's not how it felt to me. I wasn't like, I can go talk to Louis Giglio right now. He's on a big stage. He goes back behind the stage. That's that. At least that's how it felt. And then, but both of these groups, as they move forward, the people do not stay together. That's a common theme.
No, they don't.
Them.
And in fact, they merge over. Piper and Mark kind of join.
And then
together.
Then Louis would be, some would see him as kind of having softened and compromised, and then Vody went, he's very strict now. Yeah.
And many of the people listening right now don't know any of these names. Maybe
or
they
you
know
do.
some of them.
I mean, Vody Bacham is now huge because of CRT.
Yeah.
He just blew up. He was kind of known as kind of awesome Baptist pastor. Then he became really known for being very strict on kind of how the church and the family operate together.
Mm-hmm.
And now he is the face of anti-CRT in Christianity.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, when I say Marcel is responsible, like I found one of the comments where Mark and I went back and forth. I chatted with Mark when we go up there. Mark would not know who I am anymore. He wouldn't recognize me. But I could email him and I could have talked to him. I mean, that wasn't like I couldn't.
So you're not friends, but you were acquainted.
Right.
Yeah.
But there are people like Paul Mossberger, who I tracked down, who wrote a lot of the songs, who I became a friend with. I mean, we haven't talked in a long time, but we did a project with him when he wrote new music, and we introduced that music at the Village like 3 or 4 years in. So, we've done some things with those guys, but I think the thing that really struck us, in particular Sue and I, was that they were attempting to write music that was reflective of what the culture was, but also they really understood how to lament. And so their use of the minor chord, or we have a song we sing, Isaiah 55, and it has what's called the devil's chord in it, which you're not supposed to ever play at church. I mean, that used to be that way.
Right.
And still, you're not going to find it very often in church. And so it really kind of, and the creativity, they were very into the arts and very into expressive-ness. And so that was really cool to us. And that's what we longed to be part of. And we thought, hey, this is what's going to help bring people that we're connected to into hearing the gospel and engaging. And
was that true in your context, as it was with Mars Hill? Or?
It was. It moved slower because we weren't, one, I'm not Mark Driscoll, and that I don't have that great charisma. Two, I don't philosophically or theologically completely agree with Mars Hill.
Right.
And I'm much more built on slow discipleship. But especially when we were 4th Avenue, I mean, for those very few people who know who Chicago was, he was at our church a lot.
Oh, yeah. I know who he was.
Okay, so Chicago and Chicago's Klan. I mean, we still have some of those people in our community. So yes, we did reach the edgier people. And we did it. What we did, we were connected at times to the living room. If people remember the living room.
Oh, yeah.
But what happened that was different than us, for us than that, the most of the people around us doing this, is that we realized it's not a sustainable ministry. And so we, as people started having children, had to adjust the way we were doing things. Plus, we were able to sustain it where other people were not able to sustain it.
I was around for living room days early mostly, but yeah.
Yeah, we had a lot of living room people in and out of our community, and we did stuff with them off and on. Yeah, so...
The living room was a ministry. It was actually launched by one of the mega churches here in Tucson, which is interesting. But back when our downtown was very dead, it was in a storefront downtown where there now is a restaurant space underneath where Connect Co-working recently was.
They also were on 4th Ave for a while.
And then they moved to 4th Ave. But they started downtown, essentially across the street from Hotel Congress.
Right.
And it was this idea of just having a living room that was available and people there to talk. And early on, they would have pretty open like evangelism happening out on the street, as well as just kind of people hanging out inside. And then sometimes they'd have shows. It's just very much a place to be, but you could depend on Christians being there. And then it's sort of the evangelistic side of it began to wane. Yeah. And it became more like a venue.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you look at the Village, so if you come to the Village, that's what many of the littler churches connected to Mars Hill was like. Because what they did is that space is limited in Seattle. So they had 7 locations.
Yeah.
And different campus pastors who preached 90% of the time. Mark would come in once in a while and speak. He spoke at the main place. So the little satellite campuses, they all covered the same texts, but they all had a different culture. And they probably ranged from 50 to 150 people per campus.
Yeah.
And so it was these cool, unique little artist things that were all linked together in one church. And that's what the Village became. We just, in a sense, became a Seattle, a satellite of that. And it's still, I think, in a lot of ways, I mean, there's a lot of philosophical things that, Rod and I bring to the Village and others have brought over the years, that it's not Mars Hill.
No.
But it is the spirit of that.
Well, a key thing to think about, and it especially came out in the 4th episode, I would say, was that Mars Hill had a lot of great ideas.
It did.
There were a ton of needed pivots, and it's such a tragic story in that there's almost more of that. There's almost more of the good in a way. Mm-hmm. And then there are these few elements that just really did it in. And so it seems.
Yeah. And it's when I reflect on it. So for people who don't know, I mean, Mars Hill imploded, 2016 or 15 or somewhere in there. And it all just shut down. Mark,
like real fast.
Mark left, and it turned into like 8 or 9 different churches.
Yeah.
And that's good in a sense, but it's an interesting sociological study. For me personally, Marcus had such a impact on my life from afar that, and different conferences I've gone to and the few times I've talked to him, he's been really kind. He's been life-changing, and to watch him kind of disintegrate in front of me it's hard. It's sad to me, because you're like, it's when you expect someone who gives you something good to be always good.
Sure.
So I think it's hard to watch.
That's interesting. That's coming out in the podcast too, is how many people did have a lot of good interactions with him, and not just short term, like sustained good relationships. And then for me, I only saw the most shock jock moments because I didn't follow it. I was just getting people showing me on their phone, oh my gosh, check out what this guy said. So I'd see his most intense, moments of a 1-hour sermon. I'd see that 1-minute clip, or something. And so that was the impression I got, which isn't fair either, because that's not really all of what it was. But
Right.
what were when you think back and go, here were probably the most troubling couple things for you from your vantage point. What were I don't know. What were the most difficult ingredients or the parts that made it a little unhealthy in retrospect?
I think I mean, and this is kind of weird, I kind of grew past Mark in his maturity, in a sense, like in his preaching. So there was a point where I'm like, oh, I'm done with this. But I think when they started consolidating power and it was no longer a communal thing, then it was pretty much
that was
not that interesting to me.
And that seems like a very, when you look at the whole picture of it, that change seems really key.
Yes. And I think one of the things that was interesting to me, so Sue and I went up there to go to probably 2010, somewhere in there. We went to a songwriting conference that Marcel put on, and a worship thing. And there was a breakout group where they had some people from Citizen. They had Joel Brown, who'd been around there. You'll hear he was interviewed, but he is the underlying influence that's stuck in music, and that, and he was the engineer at the Paradox. He had a couple bands, but he was the influence there. And as we talked to them, and we went up and asked them questions afterwards to all the musicians, because they were talking about songwriting, and we're like, look, here's Mars Hill's philosophy in songwriting. Why is none of this being talked about? And they're like, what do you mean? And like, well, here's what Brad Kerr was trying to put into place. And they're like, oh, there was a point where they decided to completely turn their back on everything that they had done before, and they were going to really move into a more commercial, more megachurch style, the vetting of their bands, vetting of people, the moving of women out of the lead role. Some women couldn't even read scripture up front, so things like that. So they really made this huge shift to maybe what we would say from a complementarian kind of understanding to a federalist or hierarchical, rule view of men and women. And so at that point, I think Sue and I walked away and we're like, we love the music here. I mean, the music is like nothing you've ever heard anywhere. I mean, just in the quality of bands. Like the band Red Letter is one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. It just at church or anywhere else, like the musicianship, and they got musicians who play with Taylor Swift, and they're professional musicians who are playing studio all over the place, and so it's impressive. And so if you want to go to church to see that, that's great, but otherwise it's not. Why would we? It felt like the Spirit of God had moved on, and in some way, or for us at least, and we were like, we're done.
That compelling element, whatever it was, it had changed.
Yeah, well, they weren't about what do you call it? Authentic missional living anymore. They were about Mark and what you saw on Sunday.
Yeah,
and it was a different. I mean, I think I'm actually one of those people who think Sunday experience is important, but not the way they did. It was a production and a performance, and it wasn't communal anymore.
Yeah.
And it was very much, you could see they were moving into a different model.
Yeah.
And satellite, Mark was satellited everywhere. They started opening places in New Mexico and Phoenix
I saw
Orange
the New
County.
Mexico one. Yeah. Yeah. I remember we were in New Mexico to visit my mother and father-in-law, and I went, oh, there's a Mars Hill here? What?
It's crazy. It was like McDonald's.
Yeah. And then the ones coming to Phoenix, and of course you had Hillsong and Mars Hill both showing up in Phoenix, and talking to some other pastors there. They're going, I don't know if this is good. Because it's all people from churches that are thinking about moving over there.
Yeah. It changed, and for me, honestly, it was just those early days, and it wasn't just Mark Driscoll. It was the whole the young leader missional movement.
Yeah,
I mean, this is the group that coined the word missional. They're all reading New Begin.
Yeah,
So they're and you've got intellectuals like Brian McLaren, who at the time was not theologically out to lunch. He was really thoughtful and very helpful. And Doug, who was doing Solomon's Porch, and that was different with all the couches and in the round, and preaching that was flattened out, and having people interact with you as you preach, and so they were doing different things that made you think, oh, church doesn't always have to look this way. We can be creative, and with our liturgies and the way we missionally kind of engage culture and worship in front of people and help them be part of it.
So of course we have people so you've got what happened with Mars Hill, which was went a little hardcore Federalist. Maybe that's not the right word, but yeah,
Federalist is the right word. I think.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know if people would know what that means. It's hierarchical rule.
Yeah. And then you've got the McLarens and Pagets that really softened on a lot of the theological. Tony Jones, yeah. And so the movement, not only, it wasn't just Mark moved, as everybody moved from where they once all were together.
Yes.
In a way, which is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, the only people who didn't move were the theologians. Alan Roxborough, who's still around writing missional books.
Yeah.
And he didn't move. He's still where he's at.
Ed Stetzer's on the podcast, and he's a little more of a strategist, but he didn't seem to do anything drastic.
Stanley Gentz was, he was just he was thinking differently. Yeah. He wrote, books like Beyond Foundationalism and Communal Theology, but he was still in orthodoxy thinking about these things, and he didn't change, I don't think any of that.
Yeah.
And, those guys, who else was there? I mean, the guy who does all of who kind of looked like Elvis Presley. What was his name? Forget his name.
Dan Kimball?
Dan Kimball was there. He didn't really change.
Yeah.
Dan Kimball's just Dan Kimball.
Yeah, I don't know Dan Kimball. I just know he exists.
Yeah. There you go. They're just not here. I am listing names. People don't know who they are. But anyway.
Yeah.
I think Mars Hill helped us, the village, think through things. And, Mark used to talk about how fast his church was growing.
Yeah.
And since I was going to the archives yesterday, the internet archives, to look through things, I decided to look at the archives of the village website, because we have 20 years of a website. And there's a part where we would do very much parodies of Mars Hill. So we had a little thing that said, the 978,000 fastest growing church according to the Seneca House, blah, 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 of lower learning. Things so we'd have little things like that to kind of make fun of ourselves and kind of our communal self, and parody Mars Hill in a sense, and kind of make fun of them a little bit.
Which is why you're the mega house church.
Yes, why we're the mega house church, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
But I think I would say Mars Hill affected us most musically.
Yeah.
Because I would say Mars Hill and Doug Paget, and that we really were they were saying, look, play your own music. It's better to play your own music well than play someone else's poorly. And it also will tell the story of your community.
Yeah.
I think that was the big thing that we sort of realized was our community has a story. Musicians and artists tell that story and help people understand it. If we're taking in everybody else's music, it's really hard to do that. So one of the reasons we kept hold of Mars Hill's music, because it was part of our story now, and also it was free.
Yeah.
And on top of that, we were actually in some ways studying, how do they do this? How does this process happen? And it really helped us. So now the village, I think we've written 75 songs to 100 songs over the last 20 years. So
yeah,
that's helped kind of, Mars Hill helped us create that experience in some ways.
What do you think's the benefit of this story being told through the Rise and Fall podcast, and what do you think is the downside of us all soaking in this story?
Well, I think until Mark Driscoll disappears and steps down, people need to know that he has moved in a direction that's dangerous for people. And there are stories coming out of Trinity and Phoenix that are unsettling, to say the least. And so I think... And
Trinity, his new church, is different than Mars Hill was. And his views are different.
Yes, they've
now.
changed. Yeah. They have changed. And so I think people need to be wary. I think it's making people aware. I think for some of us who were around for all of it, it fills in some of the holes. Like questions I had of like, how did these guys that I know, like Tim Smith, how did he hang out with Mark for so long? I mean, Tim, isn't even anything like Mark.
Yeah.
And so how did that work? And I don't know. So it's just getting some of the inside story to all of it is helpful.
Especially for those piecing it together. And I would think for people who were very impacted by, even from a distance, like less connected than you were, it still could be helpful to go, okay, here's how and why that happened. There's something to that, isn't there? Even when you've gone through something difficult in your family or something and you learn your dad's story and you go, oh, yeah, it wasn't just simple and maybe they didn't just do it to me. There were all these factors at play.
Right.
It can kind of help you process, even though it's truly hurtful and difficult.
Yeah. No, I think it feeds the downside is it feeds sort of that voyeuristic thing.
Yeah.
That we want to know the salacious details of something. For those of us who know who Mark is, I think what is important is that Mark has had such a broad influence on young Christianity over the last 20 years. And so that had a both good and toxic thing. Mark and Dodie Bachman aren't far from each other.
Right. Well, as is often the case, right? It's people with different views but similar bents are very similar people, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, if you go and I sent the pastor's little group the little thing I said to Mark. I'm like, who is replacing you, Mark? Like, what's and he's like, well,
basically, no need to have that discussion.
Don't need to have.
I'll be here in Seattle for the rest of my life.
Yep.
Guess not.
Eric, when I read that, I went, this man's a prophet.
Oh, brother. Well, I actually deeply loved Mark and wanted him to succeed. And I was like, this doesn't look good. I mean, I was seeing that it wasn't looking good 2 years in.
Yeah. No, actually that did, I looked at that and went, well, that was insightful. And as you said in there, you'd been praying.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Mars Hill. I mean, the Village sings a lot of Mars Hill music. And actually Brad Curra, who was their original worship pastor, if you read any of his books, Mark Driscoll's books, he doesn't usually refer to Brad by his name. Sometimes he does, but he's like the worship leader who couldn't handle the intense growth. And so he quit, but that's not true. But anyway, Brad is writing some new music. He just told me, and he'll have it out soon. So we'll probably play a few more of his songs.
Yeah. Nice. We were having a conversation in our home the other day about whether or not to watch the Bill Cosby show.
Right. That's a good question.
Right? Like, is it he's an actor. The show was sweet, had a special part in people's lives. But then once you find out about who Bill Cosby was and what he was doing even during those times, for me, it gets complicated. It's hard to see him play a role that's so untrue, even though I know he's an actor. It's complicated.
Right.
It makes me think of this. What do you, when you think of Mark Driscoll and kind of everything that's come out, like, what would you say to somebody who's like, I'm still listening to him and I love the old sermons and how do you deal with this when somebody's fallen and their old material that was still good?
Right. I mean, I don't even mean this in a bad way, but people say that about John Piper, and I have a hard time with John Piper. And so it's not I mean, obviously John hasn't sinned in the ways that Mark has and been abusive to people. But I think
he also had stronger elders in the church that existed before him. So
yes,
who knows? Right?
But I think that my thing is they're really good teachers, and you should be wary of that power over you. It had a power over me, and maybe it wasn't always good. And that
it can go beyond what God
him
is
and
saying.
not necessarily Jesus.
Yeah.
Or they might offer you what they think is the right way to do stuff, and it seems successful in people's lives and in their communities. So why I should do this? I also think we just consume people's teaching now, and it has an impact on you.
Yeah.
I would encourage people to consume their local pastors, and not consume them, but listen to their local pastors a lot, and really try to follow where they're leading, and then you can supplement with Mark.
The complicated thing about your local pastor is if you're in a church like ours, you'll actually know them and how not amazing they are.
Great.
But as you listen to a podcast like this one, it turns out that somebody who everybody thought was amazing, the closer you were, the more complicated it was.
Yeah.
That's always, you're always dealing with broken, flawed, potentially used by God, but broken people. And it's better to know that. And then I think.
Well, and I mean, there are Christians who come to the village, and one of the things that they say, when they plug in, people who've grown up in the church, and they've either become a little disillusioned with the church, or they've just not been able to be wherever they're at, and they come to the village, and you know why they stay? They stay not because of the great community, not because of the great music. They usually stay because the teaching is amazing.
Right.
Now, I don't think the teaching is amazing, but what I do realize is that it has some novelty to it.
Right.
It's approached differently.
Yeah.
And I think it's good. I mean, I'm not saying it's not good, and I don't want to diss what they're saying, but I think what Mark had was a novelty to the extreme.
Yeah.
So for me, who grew up in the church, I'd never heard Bible teaching this way. I'd never heard it so raw. I'd never heard a call to be something much bigger than I was, and to follow Jesus in a way, like with a whole, like, be completely sold out, like be in or out, be hot or cold, don't be lukewarm. And that invitation with that much kind of Chris Rock style preaching, where there was deep, it wasn't just like the fluffy humor. Like he somehow managed to like really delve deep and be Chris Rock at the same time. And so that was a novelty, and you get caught up in that a little bit. And I'm not saying people in my church who are listening to this shouldn't get caught up in the preaching at the village. I just think that when you're challenged to really deal with your life and your sin, and your life is changing, it's very easy for you to not think about the other parts.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, that's, and you hear it in the podcast. People they're saying, we excused a lot of Mark because of our own life change and the change that we were seeing around us. And I think that was a big deal.
Yeah.
And,
it's got to be kind of a both and. Like, where things aren't necessarily excused, but you also do recognize the good things. It's, right? Somehow there's got to be that balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when I go to a church, I look for... I want to not be like, oh, wow, the teacher is amazing, and I'm not sure about everything else. I want it to feel integrated in some sense, like that this is communal, like in the way that things are happening in the community, in the church. And it's not just, here's our guy, and this is what we're really about, and we do these other things, but this is what we're about. It's this person. I think when you're about a person, it's very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, people are charismatic.
Yeah.
And so it's okay to have charisma, but I think people who have charisma need to submit themselves to really strong, accountability.
Yeah.
So that their gifts can be used, but the community can do it in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. So I don't think Mark, it's obvious that Mark was not submitted to it.
That's one of the key things I see is even like some of the concerns that people had. I think that some of that could have been very easily kind of walked through, but you could just see that he wasn't hearing it.
Oh no. And Mike Gunn, who I knew better than Mark Driscoll, who was one of the founding pastors of Mars Hill, there's a little comment about how Mark was like, I don't think you can grow a church past 200. Mike was the only guy who could really stand up to Mark. He was bigger than Mark. He was more, like he was more visible man than Mark. And Mark's always the tough guy. And and he would stand up to him. And I don't really know what happened to Mike. I'm looking forward to hearing if they interview Mike Gunn.
Well, it's interesting. It's not just that, Mark was, I think leaders do need to be convinced of things. So even that a leader would be like, hey, I think I'm right here. That's not shocking to me. I think you need somebody with some conviction, but the structures that were put into place were such that if somebody did say something like that, they could just be fired.
Right.
Right. Instead of them actually getting to have an impact on the situation or even kind of have to work it out over a long period of time, they could just be, get out, you're in the way, or you're asking the wrong questions, as like with that lady who was the secretary who just brought up, I think he could use other men in his life. And so that was something that spoke to me.
That was a terrifying story.
Yeah.
That was really sad.
Yeah. Yep. So I don't know. I mean, I think every leader listening to it probably is sobered a bit, going, "Ooh, I see some of myself in there." But then I hope that every leader in every church are going, here are a couple of pretty simple things we could do to not end up there, like a plurality of elders that actually can vote a thing down. That's, to me, pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, Sue and I were chatting about some of this, and I was laughing. I was like, yeah, if Mark Crawford just made me angry for some reason. I'm like, Mark, you're fired. It's it. You're done. One, he'd laugh at me. Rod would laugh at me. And then the whole church would laugh at me.
You're right.
There's just no.
That's where you'd be done.
Right.
or they'd be going, hold on.
You don't have that power. Right. Even when people do say at the village, because, they see me kind of what we would say as a lead pastor. No one thinks that I have the power to be like, you're fired. Okay, we're rearranging these things. No, there's too many checks down the line, and a community that doesn't just value me. They value all of their leaders and aren't going to let that happen.
Right.
There might be 8 people left in the church if I were to do something like that and could push it through.
Right.
Because everybody would be like, no, we're done.
But at the same time, I think the flip side of that is that you do have a lot of power in that the village is very influenced and shaped by you. So the chances of, and part of why that's so laughable is because Mark Crawford is where he is because he is sat under you and really respects the type of church that you've built for years and years. And if he wasn't into the kind of vision that you have, he never would have grown up in this leadership structure either.
Right.
So it's not like, I don't ever want to advocate for this flat, non-led kind of church because it isn't that.
No.
But it's how people do grow up into leadership, and then, the fact that the power isn't held in just one person's hands, but also that things are understood and known. And if you have a disagreement, you're so embedded, like here, he's so embedded in the church.
Right.
He's known as well as you are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that's I think it's important. I think that, and I also think, I think the flattened out part is that when you're in community together, a community of leaders and a community of people on mission, that there's a freedom, maybe not to say, oh, Elder X, you're totally in sin and you need to confess without proper biblical process. But if I hurt somebody's feelings, they don't need to go grab another elder and say, hey, I need to confront you because you hurt my feelings. They can just say, hey, what you said was hard for me and you hurt my feelings and I don't think it was right. And I can be like, oh, okay. Right. I can think that through. I don't need to call you and have a meeting with you and tell you that you're way off base. It's just like, yeah, I respect you and I'm hospitable to you and vice versa. And we can work these things through without the weird power things that go on.
Right.
And so I think that's what I love about the village. I'm assuming that that's present from my observations at Mission. And I would argue if you're at Mission Church or you're at the Village, you're really at two really good churches. And I think they're churches that deeply care about their people and are unwilling to just to write people off.
Right.
No, that doesn't mean that people won't leave and that they won't be upset and won't be hurt. But I think that is a general feeling and goal of the ministry is to care for people and to lead them to Jesus and to be long-suffering together.
Right. And yeah, absolutely. And I think that, as you just said, and there have been there's a long list of people who've like observed our churches or tried them, been like, nah, I don't like that. Right. So I'm not saying, everybody's going to love it.
No.
But I think that there's a high commitment level between the church and people, and that's hard to do. And not everybody even wants it that way.
No.
Right. But it's available in these churches. And we're trying, we have things in place where you really can appeal and kind of say, hey, I'm hurt. This isn't good. You can do that. Yeah.
You can. And if you're committed to working it through, people will work it through with you.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, good to see you, man.
It's really good to see you. It's good to do a podcast.
Yeah, seriously.
I do have to say, this is funny. You don't like these things, but we haven't had a podcast in a while.
Yeah.
So I was expecting that when the data came up on our podcast, that it would be low. People aren't going to listen.
Yeah.
Well, there were 220 podcasts listened to on Faith Over Breakfast over the last week. And guess which one got 100 podcasts listened to last week?
My least favorite one. I don't know. I don't know
Jordan
which one
Peterson,
that is. Oh,
which hardly ever, gets any listens.
Oh, really?
Just got 100. I mean, it has
must have some.
It has 800 listens on it right now, but it just either a bot grabbed it or there was some Jordan Peterson thing that hit this last week, and so people were hunting down.
The Gospel Coalition put an article out about him.
Okay, that would
I wonder if something like that
and those
got people thinking.
Are probably in our listening group. So,
some of them,
yeah. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I was like, "What? Oh, Jordan Peterson just bumped us up."
That is interesting.
Yeah. So thank you, Jordan.
Yeah,
helping
seriously.
Circulate us.
And if you have, as we've said many times, if you have topics you're interested in, faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com is how to email us. If you're into our podcast, a rating on any of the platforms would be awesome. And 5 stars is great, but be honest. We're also not opposed to somebody saying, "Boo, this stinks." It makes it look more authentic, Yes. But whatever. Seriously though, just engaging with us in that way, that's really helpful.
Right.
And thanks for sitting with us for our coffee and conversation.
All right. You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.